Olá, meu nome é Érica Fraga, eu sou repórter da Folha de São Paulo e entrevistarei hoje o economista Branko Milanovic, considerado um dos expoentes da pesquisa sobre desigualdade global. Essa conversa é parte de um conjunto de entrevistas que temos feito em comemoração aos 100 anos da Folha de São Paulo, que ocorrerá agora em fevereiro deste ano. Hello, Professor. I hope you are doing well in these challenging times that we are living, and thank you so much for joining us today for this chat.
Thank you very much for having me. Of course, it's a pleasure to be there, and of course, indeed, the times are very challenging.
In your most recent book, you present a new understanding of the development of the global economic order, whereby you say that although capitalism has prevailed, it assumed two different formats across the globe. So can you please summarize to us the main similarities and differences between those two kinds of capitalism and explain which were the main historical forces that lead to their existence?
Yes, this is exactly what I did. But I have to say, as you said actually at the very end of your question, there is a historical element which is quite important in my book. I could have done, as many maybe political philosophers or economists do, they simply compare US and China. This is very popular these days because obviously these are the two big rivals. However, my objective was rather to present historical evolution, and in particular to explain the global historical role of communism. So it's one of the important topics in the book. Actually, the chapter on China starts and develops that theme. So essentially, my argument there, to summarize it, was that in countries that were colonized and that were sort of semi-feudal or feudal, it was really the left-wing parties and communist parties that in the 20th century basically transformed these countries in two ways. First, they liberated them from colonialism, and secondly, they got rid of all the institutions of feudalism. So many of them, like China and Vietnam, were essentially building socialism. However, it turned out over the period of years or decades that capitalism really was more progressive, or at least more efficient system than socialism. And they gradually moved towards the use of the private sector and market much more than planning and public sector. So that was the argument how China, in my opinion, became capitalist. And capitalist in the infrastructure sense, in the sense of the production, whereas, of course, politically, it remained an authoritarian system, or what I call political capitalism. On the other hand, countries of the West, in particular the United States, of course, went through also evolution. And there I discuss, but not very much, but I discuss the passage from social democratic systems to much more neoliberal system, and what I call liberal all meritocratic capitalism today of the United States.
So one common feature of those two kinds of capitalisms is a tendency towards higher inequality. Why do like those two different models both produce a high level of inequality?
Yes, this is of course a really important and crucial question. I do distinguish 6 systemic sort of forces that push inequality up. I will mention only a couple of them. For example, a very high share or increasing share of income which comes from capital. Now that's important because people who have a large share of income received from capital are generally rich. So in other words, if the capital in national accounts is getting bigger and bigger, that has a quasi-automatic transmission into interpersonal inequality, because people who receive that are essentially people who are at the top of the income distribution. So this is one of the forces. There are other forces, including intermarriage among people who are both very highly educated and rich, and of course then control of the political process. China, on the other hand, also is a country with not only high inequality, but actually inequality which is higher than the US inequality. It is the result of rapid development, movement of labor from agriculture into industry, increased unemployment, increased returns to education, a large share of capital income, but it's also the result of very strong corruption in China, and also linkage in China as well between the political power and economic power. So you can actually see that the two systems do actually do reproduction of the elite, and they have both created an elite which is both economic elite and a political elite. And very often these are the same people who are both political and economic elite.
Inequality obviously is an important topic, and apparently has become even more important over the past decade or so. But some critics say that maybe we're focusing so much in inequality, whereas maybe we should be more concerned about the overall absolute level of living conditions, and so the most important thing would actually be guaranteeing that everyone gets better off independently of the distance between people. Would you say to people who believe this, why is inequality important in itself?
Yes, actually, let me first answer the first part of the question, because this is the question that often people ask. They say, like, isn't poverty more important? Yes, I would agree. Obviously, our first objective should be to eliminate absolute poverty and not have anybody live in a poverty. That doesn't mean that there are no other issues that are important. Actually, we are able to keep 2 or 3 issues in our mind. It doesn't mean that we have to only focus on one. Very often when people say, oh, I really care only about poverty, I don't care about inequality, are really people who basically are indifferent to extremely high levels of inequality, and moreover, who can do nothing about poverty. So it's really basically oftentimes an ideological defense. So it is not really a genuine feeling. Now, if it was a genuine feeling, yes, of course, as I said before, poverty is really crucially important. It's number one. Now, why does inequality per se, regardless of poverty, why is it an important issue? First, it is important because we have increasing number of studies that show that very unequal countries are slower in terms of growth. In other words, if you have a very unequal country, oftentimes, whether it is because of political disagreements, whether it was because of political instability or economic instability, you actually do not produce rates of growth that more homogeneous, more equal societies do. So it's the first argument. So it's instrumental argument. The second argument, again empirically, we see that societies that have very high inequality are societies of unequal opportunity. For example, Brazil is a very good example. Where you are born, who were your parents, whether you are, of a white, black, or, mixed race or whatever, would influence the results. So that is in itself, of course, against the essential sort of theoretical, how should I say, philosophical objectives that every person should have equal chance. Moreover, it is inefficient, because if poor people cannot go to have education, they are not contributing to society nor to themselves. And the third very important argument, again, I think Brazil may be a good example of that as well, is that when you have very high inequality, those people who are rich try to control the political process, which means that they try to introduce or impose regulations and laws that would maintain that political position, because they are not crazy. They are not going to have the laws which would undermine them.
How would you classify South America and particularly Brazil within these two kind of different models?
Clearly, if we just look at the current situation, we would classify practically all Latin American countries and countries of liberal meritocratic capitalism. I have to say that when I say meritocratic, does not mean that it's not used in the term in the sense that being meritocratic, you are actually, everybody gets what he or she deserves. The term is from John Rawls, and it means simply meritocratic, that you don't have legal impediments to getting any job or position in society. Now, historically, Latin American countries became independent in the 1820s approximately, or in the early part of the 19th century. So this argument that I used before, when I used about China and India and African countries and Indonesia and many countries in Asia about the role of left-wing and communist parties really applies to the period after these parties came into existence. It could not, the communist parties came out in existence in 1920s. They could not have a role in 1820s.
Basically, history also helps to explain why we here in South America ended up like being more developing a system more similar to the American one, right?
Yeah, I think so, actually. Even in many respects, even if you look politically, Latin American countries are also interesting because their political system, which is presidential practically in all of them, is very much copied after the American system. But so they're very strong, obviously, influence both of the United States and clearly of Europe, of Spain and Portugal, and of European exploitation of the indigenous population. So all of that, of course, has is the background, and of course slavery, which was of course very common in and very large actually in many Latin American countries.
Professor, there has been a lot of political and economic turbulence, both in South America and specifically in Brazil in recent years. The common view here in Brazil is that the combination between corruption and economic mismanagement have put an end to the rule of the Partido dos Trabalhadores, PT, and this ended up with the election of Jair Bolsonaro. Do you think that the election of Bolsonaro shows something about Brazil's population preference for either kind or at least some aspects of one kind of capitalism or the other? Does it fit in what you have seen like as trends in the global economic order and social development?
Yeah, obviously I don't know the Brazilian politics well, but my impression was, as many people have mentioned, that Bolsonaro's election fitted quite well with the elections of, or at least politics of people like Trump or Modi in India. I do believe that corruption, and certainly big corruption, and control of the state by the essentially corrupt people and de facto mafia is certainly bad. In some cases, corruption can be also a way to speed up development. That's not very popular to defend that kind of a corruption, but I do think that's important to make distinctions between various types of corruption. And certainly the big one that we very often experience at the top of the government is certainly bad.
Brazil is a democratic system. There was an election and a choice. I mean, does it say something about people's current preferences and where these preferences may be moving towards one direction or another?
Yeah, obviously, if people have elected Bolsonaro, that means that they wanted him to be president. So it does show something about the preferences. The question that I have, and of course that was my impression, is whether the judiciary processes were always independent or whether the judiciary processes were depending on the political side. So, it is very difficult to say that, because you can actually say, if you look, for example, at South Korea. South Korea also had a president who is now in jail and who was also impeached. U.S. will actually probably have a president which is strangely impeached and found guilty after leaving the office. So sometimes one wonders, is it really that the processes were actually just being done by the judiciary independently, or is the judiciary being instrumentalized by one side? And I think that's the big political issue where I think reasonable people may not always agree.
But both in the United States under Trump and here in Brazil with Bolsonaro, there have been frequent clashes between the elected presidents and the media. What's your take on these conflicts and on how the media helps to shape trends in both political and economic developments? as the ones that you have documented?
Well, I will speak about the United States. Of course, it is obvious that the media and the dominant or mainstream media have been against Trump from the very beginning, and they've been against Trump in a way that I've lived in the U.S. a long time, and they have never been like that against any president. So it's very clear. And on the other hand, he has also behaved in a very, as we all know, very different, very unorthodox manner, and got into direct fights and did what they call many lies or invention and so on. So I think that to some extent Trump also lived in a world of his own creation. However, I'm actually very unhappy, and I think it's potentially very dangerous what we have seen at the very end of the presidency, where Twitter and Facebook and other media have started essentially censorship. I don't think it's the role of the social media, which are a tool, like the way that the paper is a tool. When I use a paper to write whatever I write, the paper owner is not going to tell me whether what I wrote on the paper is right or wrong. The same thing, I believe, is true for the social media. Social media are simply a tool. When we are now using our social media to speak, it's a tool. That social media, that screen, should not tell me if I'm right or wrong. This is the role for you, for your media, for the commentators, for other listeners to say I agree or disagree, but not for the tool. And that I find extremely important and concerning, because they have acquired immense power. And they are private companies. So they are actually now able to essentially decide who can speak and who cannot speak, and moreover, to say whether they believe that particular opinion is accurate or not. So that, I think, is an entirely new development. And it really reminds me of the Middle Ages, where or actually under communist regimes. Let me give you the example. You had some countries where actually people who were in charge of the Xerox machine were found guilty if somebody else would use the Xerox machine to actually copy some anti-state quote-unquote publication. This is exactly the same. So the person who is in control of the Xerox machine is not responsible for what I'm writing. But the government actually wanted to make him or her responsible in order to basically stop the publication.
The world has suffered a huge shock with the coronavirus pandemic, and this happened after you wrote your book. So I was curious to ask you what happened. I mean, if the pandemic has reinforced patterns, or if it has actually changed patterns.
In my opinion, currently, because we're still in the midst of the pandemic, so we don't know really how it would eventually play out. But what I think the pandemic so far has shown, first, I think that it would actually accelerate globalization of labor, simply because we have found out that it is quite possible to do your work while you're being remotely, you're not at the workplace. Now, that means that globalization might start in some professions, mimicking a global labor market, even if people are not physically present. So, this would, I think, make a difference, because so far we have had really globalization of capital, but very little of globalization of labor. The second thing that would change very clearly is, unfortunately, the relationship between the US and China, because I think that the conflict has been exacerbated by the pandemic, by Trump's policies, by the imposition of tariffs, and we are basically now in the second Cold War. So I think that we would remember the pandemic as the beginning of the second Cold War. What I would have changed in the book, I think that one thing that I am now somewhat different opinion is that I was very generally negative about the role of universal basic income. Because one of the arguments was also that a society where maybe 10-15% of people would by choice never work is not a good society. A society where actually work is, I think, a fundamental human activity. Now, why I've changed a little bit on that is because I've seen with the stimulus stimulus packages in many countries, including Brazil, that it would have been much simpler if you had UBI, Universal Basic Income, because one would not have to go through the legislature and through this whole process, which we have seen it in the US is really difficult. And actually, until the very end of this year, of last year, we didn't know if there will be the second package or not. So in that sense, UBI would provide a security, a given security, over the whole period.
As you said, we're still not through the pandemic, unfortunately, but for what we saw up to now, which countries were more prepared and was either like liberal capitalism or political capitalism more able to deal with the crisis?
I think what is clear so far is that I don't think that there is a split between a difference between sort of democracies and non-democracies. I think where there is a split is between East Asia and the rest of the world, in particular Europe, North America, and Latin America. Africa has done pretty well, partly maybe because it has young population, partly because the death may be undercounted, but luckily it has done better than people feared. But the split between Asian developments, East Asian developments, and the rest of the world are absolutely mind-boggling. If you look at the ratio between the death per million people, we are not talking about the difference which is 1 to 2 or 1 to 3. We are talking about the difference which is 1 to 200. So there is so much explaining to do why European countries and the United States and countries in Latin America, obviously Peru the most, and then Brazil, and then Argentina, were so unprepared. And not only unprepared, they're now 1 year into the crisis and they're still unprepared. And I think that we need really to look what we can learn from East Asia.
Do you have any clues that you can share with us? What made the difference there was like you talk in the book a lot about the bureaucracy that is very efficient under the systems. I mean, does this help to explain this? And do you think this whole situation makes China even stronger than what it was before in the global arena?
For China, let me reply that very quickly. I don't think it was a good news for China in the following sense. China actually can claim rightly to have done much better in the pandemic than the United States. I mean, by several orders of magnitude. The problem is that it was not an interest of China to start the Second Cold War. So this pandemic certainly contributed to that, and Trump's own opinion, where he basically saw China as undermining his presidency because of the pandemic, I think then contributed to the anti-Chinese opinion in the United States. So I think that China in the longer term is a loser from the pandemic, despite the fact that it has handled the pandemic very well. But what can other countries learn from East Asia? I think it's a question for political philosophers, for obviously epidemiologists, for others. Of course, my impression, and other people have written, is that technocratic governments that are being trusted by the people and the discipline of the people are crucial.